Hello everyone, this is my Chapter 8 discussion video. I'll start with question 1, which says, identify and describe 3 specific ways in which slavery shaped wealth inequality between black and white Americans. So I think the first way that slavery shaped wealth inequality between black and white Americans was that black slaves were not allowed to own land when they were slaves, and so because of this, whites had more net worth and more wealth because they owned more property because the slaves weren't allowed to. Then our textbook slightly talks about this on pages 196 and 197. Secondly, I think slavery contributed a lot to how white people think of themselves as superior and look down upon black Americans. And then this idea can be tied back to how whites are given more opportunities in the workplace and thus make more money and have more wealth than black Americans. And then lastly for this question, once slavery ended or after a slave was freed, the African Americans were already at an unfair advantage because they were trailing behind the whites on the net worth scale. So while these black slaves were being owned with no assets, the white slave owners were using these slaves as assets and as property, and they were using these slaves to expand their own wealth. So then when they were freed from being slaves, they were already at a disadvantage, and this disadvantage has been carried on through generations. Question 2 says, discuss 3 specific ways in which racial segregation in the housing market is still a problem in U.S. society. Provide a specific example to illustrate each problem you discuss. So one example, which was discussed in our textbook actually on page 201, is racial steering. And this is when real estate agents only show houses in white neighborhoods to whites and only show houses in black neighborhoods to blacks. And I think this is occasionally still seen in today's society. Just an example, in my hometown, all the neighborhoods near our country club are primarily owned, or pretty much only owned by either elderly whites or white families in general. And then I think another reason for racial segregation and why it's still a problem in the housing market is simply because of past discrimination. So these lower class neighborhoods that are typically inhabited by people of color continue to be solely inhabited by people of color because of these other problems in society that keep them in the lower class, such as inequality in the labor market, as we talked about in the last chapter. Since they don't get a good job, then they don't get a good house, and so that's why these neighborhoods they're classified into these neighborhoods. And then lastly for this question, I think that racial segregation in the housing market is still relevant today because they're being held in their neighborhood by stereotypes. And so what I mean by that is African American families may feel that if they move into a new neighborhood that is primarily inhabited by white families, they will be discriminated against more, and the white families might not want to move into a primarily black neighborhood because they may feel unsafe because of these unfair stereotypes about African Americans. The last question, question 3, says, according to the text, is it correct to state that residential segregation is due to people of color / non-white groups' preferences to live among others with similar experiences? Why or why not? So I thought about this question quite a bit, and I'd say according to our text, this is not the reason for residential segregation, because on page 199 our textbook states a combination of 3 forces led to residential segregation, one being collective racial violence carried out by whites, 2 being federal housing programs and policies that exclusively benefited whites, and 3 being practices created and reinforced by the nascent real estate industry. An example of that would be the racial steering by real estate agents, as I talked about in my previous question. So residential segregation, as our textbook says, is not due to people of color preferring to live among others with the same experiences. However, as I mentioned while answering the previous question, I believe that some people stay where they are at, or where the neighborhood that they're in, because they're in fear of backlash if they move. So in a way, I guess they are preferring to stay with others who share similar experiences, but I don't think this is the driving force and not the factor that created residential segregation. I think that's it. So thank you for watching this video, and I'm looking forward to watching your guys's. Thank you.